I'm China Mieville. I'm a writer of science fiction and fantasy, and I'm here to take a look at the exhibition Out of This World, Science Fiction but Not As You Know It. When we're discussing the history of science fiction, certain names are justly celebrated, like Wells and Verne and Edward Bellamy. But part of the job of this exhibition is to try to claim as ancestors people who aren't necessarily always associated with the field. So for example, here we have Utopia by Thomas More. But for me, even more excitingly, we have the extraordinary 17th century Utopia, The Blazing World by Margaret Cavendish. And seeing texts like this and seeing them celebrated as part of this tradition is very exciting. What we have here is one of the great alien invaders of all science fiction, the tripod Martians of H.G. Wells' War of the Worlds. Now, on the one hand, that book was a brilliant, ripping yarn, but it's also, and quite explicitly, it's a critique of imperialism. And that attempt to use the tropes and the ideas of science fiction as a way of exploring political ideas, often very critically, is something that goes back before H.G. Wells, through to Jonathan Swift and earlier, and is also something that still goes on today. First edition Frankenstein, part of the Frankenstein cluster, this extraordinary keystone text, one of the founding texts of modern science fiction by the amazing prodigy Mary Shelley, a book which I think is regularly misrepresented. And when people say, oh, it's a book about the dangers of meddling with things which should be left alone, I think this is nonsense. I think it's a book about the dangers of not taking responsibility for things and trying to run away from them, and how that can go horribly wrong. In the exhibition, we can see some of the enormous variety of imaginary worlds, cheek by jowl. So you end up with the really charming spectacle of the imaginary lands, invented worlds of the Bronte sisters, right next to the Codex Seraphinius, which is an extraordinary art book, not about, but from an imaginary world. It's nice to see an exhibition in which the literature of science fiction is so focused on, but they haven't done that to the exclusion of other forms. So we do, for example, have comic books covered, and even more esoteric forms. So here, rather excitingly, is an original score from Doctor Who. One of the things that's always intoxicating about exhibitions like this is seeing the original manuscripts of what later turn out to be really important and exciting books. Sometimes these are basically just scrawls, and they're exciting because of their historical place. But sometimes, like with Angela Carter's manuscript of The Infernal Desire Machines of Dr. Hoffman, they're also objects of extraordinary beauty themselves. Anyone who reads a lot of science fiction is always asked, how did you get into this? And my answer is always, well, how did you get out of it? Because if you take the typical class of 6- and 7-year-olds, they love stories about monsters and aliens and other worlds and other planets and so on. What happens is that after a certain time, some of them leave those things behind, but others of us remain true to those obsessions.